forgot to ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll take another moment, another minute or two to allow more people to come in from the waiting room, and then we will begin. Thank you for joining us. Okay, everyone, I think we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is, and happy International Women's Day. My name is Jade Sasser. I am an associate professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UCR, soon to be in the Department of Society, Environment, and Health Equity, and I am thrilled to welcome all of you here for today's talk by Dr. Carolyn Finney, titled Memory Divine, Black Faces, Green Spaces, and Playing the Long Game. Today's talk is part of the year-long Mellon Sawyer seminar series of events, and the theme of the series is Unarchiving Blackness. In this series, we explore how the archives of Black life shape historical narratives of the past, impact the material conditions of African and African diasporic people in the present, and create imaginative possibilities of vibrant Black life in the future. I want to note that the talk is sponsored by the Mellon Foundation and co-sponsored by UCR's Center for Ideas and Society, African American Studies Program, African Student Programs, and the newly approved Department of Society, Environment, and Health Equity. I would also like to offer a land acknowledgement. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Kawia, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples, all of their ancestors and all of their descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting places home to many Indigenous people from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. So now to introduce our speaker, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Carolyn Finney, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for, I think, about 15 years now. Time really flies. So Carolyn is an artist, a storyteller, an author, and a cultural geographer. She has a BA, an MA, and a PhD in geography from Clark University, where she was a Fulbright and a Canon National Science Scholar Fellow. Along with public speaking, writing, media engagements, consulting, and teaching, she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. She is currently working on her new book of creative nonfiction that takes a more personal journey into the very complicated relationship between race, land, and belonging in the United States. I had to cut down a little bit on her bio because it is so extensive and prolific, but she is also working on a performance piece at the intersections of this work as well. Along with being the new columnist at the Earth Island Journal, she was recently awarded the Alexander and Ilse Melamid Medal from the American Geographical Society and is a scholar in residence in the Franklin Environmental Center at Middlebury College. You can find out more about Carolyn at carolynfinney.com. Welcome, Carolyn. I am excited to hear about your presentation. And just to everyone who has joined us, please feel free to add your comments and thoughts to the chat. We will hold the Q&A at the end of the discussion. Don't be shy. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, so please do add your questions and we will take them at the end. Carolyn, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you to everyone in the room for coming into the conversation. I'm going down here to my share screen because we got to have some photos to start things off. I've just got to, yeah. All right. A couple of things I want to say, a lot of things I want to say, but a couple of things that I want to start off with is that the last time I saw Jade was actually January of 2020, right? So I was in person in LA. I was there to speak at Loyola Marymount, and Jade and I went to dinner. And so I want to say that because I always think of that time, as many of us do, as BC before COVID, and how grateful I am actually to be here now, and I mean that in a lot of different ways. Also, I think about the land acknowledgement. So I'm here in Burlington, Vermont. I've been here for about 3.5 years. I've moved around a lot, but this is my present home, and I say that really loosely, and that's a longer conversation. And it's the traditional home of the Abenaki people, or Abenaki, depending on how you want to say it. But that's all I'm going to say about it, because I spoke with a Abenaki woman here named Judy Dow, an educator, and in her mind, she says she thinks the thing that many of us don't understand about land acknowledgements, it's a good thing for any of us to say the thing, right? It's the place of start. But when I was just confused about how much I should say or not say, she said it's about your relationship to the place. And sometimes it can take, she said she's working with this white woman who's been working on her land acknowledgement for 3 years. And I just I got very overwhelmed by that idea. So what I want to say to you is that, I'm still trying to get to know this place. And I want to do my best to try to recognize that there were so many people here before, and there are so many people here now as well. And not only people about that. So, okay, yeah. Stories of now, which is what I've been sort of starting off with. Since 2020, I will say that I'm privileged to be able to spend most of my time doing this work all the time, right? The residency at Middlebury is 2 days a week. I purposefully, try to work with an institution to create a situation where I'm not full-time in the institution. And I did that for a lot of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about, which isn't unrelated to some of the things I'm talking about today. And what that means is that I spend a lot of my time having these conversations. I counted. And since 2020, I've probably engaged around 250 times, either giving talks like this, consulting, facilitation, being asked to write about it, to hold it over and over and over and over and over again. And I'm incredibly grateful I get to do it. I'm incredibly grateful I get to pay the rent this way. It's not something my parents could have ever imagined for themselves. I'm also really exhausted, and I think a lot about the emotional labor that goes in having a conversation about Blackness and anything, and Blackness and land in particular. In 2020, right after George Floyd was murdered, The Guardian, the newspaper, reached out to me and said, would you write a piece? So this is, I guess, 2020, summer of 2020. Would you write a piece about Christian Cooper? Actually, they wanted to know Christian Cooper, the self-identified Black gay man who walked into Central Park, had his skin weaponized against him by Amy Cooper. And I said, well, I'm happy to write a piece about Christian Cooper, but I can only do that if I can also write about George Floyd, because you need to understand that for many of us who identify as Black, it's a continuum. And at one end of the continuum, you're Christian Cooper. You are insecure, you are unsure about your place, you're being called out in particular ways. At the other end of the continuum, you could be killed, and that's George Floyd. And that's a reality every day. And a lot of us operate in the gray area, somewhere in the middle all the time. So I'm always holding that, thinking about that continuum, thinking about the diversity of that experience, the complexity of Black experience. And I will keep referencing that because I'm going back to what I understand the theme here is of the seminar, Unarchiving Blackness. And in my mind, I interpret it as, what does it mean to sort of lift up, reveal, bring back, the stories of Blackness on the land and in place in a very particular way. And what does that actually demand? I wrote here also, who are we that do the remembering? Who are we that do the remembering? And for me, I kept coming back to this, who does the archiving, the writing and speaking about Black people on the land? And what does it cost to do that? What does it cost to do it over and over and over again? Not just how we do it, but who actually does it, and what is it that we need in order to continue to show up in this way? I say that, when I think about what's happening down in Florida and other places in this country, about the erasure of Black history, of Black experience by he who I shall not name, that's doing the good work down there of, and I'm tongue in cheek when I say that, of erasing Black experience and Black stories. I was thinking about how we're done with Black History Month. And I always say that, I'm always a little cynical about that, with respect to Carter G. Woodson, whose original intention was to bring attention to Black presence on the landscape back in 1926, more power to him. But almost 100 years later, we are still having this conversation. We are still fighting, many of us, to say that our stories have relevance, and not only just for us, but for this entire country, and trying to find multiple rigorous ways to actually make that case over and over and over again. So I'm more than upset about the current moment. I wrote here, it's not hard to be all up in my feelings as I bear witness to the the continued attempted erasure of Black history, of American history in some of our schools, and ultimately in all of our conversations. And for me, there's a lot of irony in this, that it's starting out in Florida, and this conversation is being had out loud in Florida in a very particular way, because in 2005, when I was doing research on Black faces and white spaces as my dissertation, that's where I based myself for a year. I based myself in part because of the 3 national park sites that were there, but also because of the Black history that was there. And I was just amazed at things that I knew there was going to be Black history there. I had no idea the stories that I was going to end up uncovering there, the conversations I was going to have, from wealthy Black families who bought pieces of land and made it their own, to Black families from back in the 1800s who were claiming land that's now part of national park sites, to sitting in the trailer of a Tuskegee Airman having a conversation about his place there. All kinds of Black history on that land, Virginia Key Beach. It goes on and on and on and on. So it's interesting to me. The irony is that what's going on down there right now. So Jade mentioned that, 4 times a year, I write a column for the Earth Island Journal. It's a journal out of Berkeley, California. And I've been doing this going into my 3rd year. And I just did my most recent column, which I called, "What Would Harriet Tubman Do?" And I love calling on Harriet. I know we call on her all the time, but I had to call on Harriet yet again because I saw this cartoon that you're seeing in front of you, right? The new Underground Railroad. And one of the things I really love about this image is the smiles, particularly on one woman's face, as they kind of dig out the Black history that people will do what they need to do. Harriet says, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. So I want to talk about, how do we keep going? Again, what does that look like? Who does the work? What does that entail? What do we need? And why should we keep doing it? Nikki Finney, who many of you may know, Nikki Finney, she's not related to me more than being a friend of mine, but she's an incredible African-American poet. She's won a National Book Award. She's just does amazing work. And one of the many quotes that I like to use of hers is, "If we don't save our own material, nobody will." And I remember when I heard her say that just at the beginning of COVID, her most recent book, Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, had just come out. And so she was doing a virtual thing online. And I was writing down pretty much everything she said and really thinking about that. If we don't save our own material, who will? You're looking at a painting right now of a Black artist named Jennifer Packard. And in 2021, she had a show at the Whitney. And it's called The Eye is Not Satisfied with Seeing. The eye is not satisfied with seeing. And here's where she explores the nuances of Black life, longing, loss, and wonderment, right? And I wrote in parentheses for myself because we hold multitudes, right? It's not just the bad things that happen to us, but we hold all those things, sometimes at the same time. The Black writer Seph Rodney asks the question in reference to her work, quote, "What is my responsibility to see? Who will hold us accountable?" What is my responsibility to see, and who will hold us accountable? In 2021 as well, Maura Cheeks, another Black writer, wrote a piece in the Paris Review, and it's entitled, "Isn't Black Representation What We Wanted?" Isn't Black representation what we wanted? And she talks about Fran Lebowitz, who self-identifies herself as a Jewish woman. She's a thinker, a speaker, a prolific writer. And Fran Lebowitz, in a conversation with the American director Martin Scorsese, says that she doesn't understand people who complain about not seeing themselves in books. She doesn't understand why people complain about not seeing themselves in books. She says, quote, "A book is not supposed to be a mirror. It's supposed to be a door," end quote. So Maura Cheeks, the woman who's writing this article about this conversation, says, quote, "I understand the sentiment, but I disagree with the argument. It's the type of sentiment that can only be felt by someone who was unknowingly represented almost everywhere she turned." She didn't know what she had. Later on in the article, Fran Lebowitz has a conversation with the Black writer, Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison says to Fran Lebowitz, "I am the reader of the books I write." And Fran says, "Your other readers aren't you." And Morrison just laughs and says, "Yes, they are." So I've been thinking about this. I think about this all the time in terms of issues of representation, whose stories are centered, who was centered, how we frame our understanding, and as well as where our bias comes into play. I've been thinking about that, since, I think a lot about land and ecology and environment and nature. When I think about folks like Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, whose voices and experiences have defined a set of practices and memories of who we are as human beings and as Americans in relation to non-human nature, and how we grow that relationship and what the relationship is supposed to look like. It is regulated, it is commodified, it is practiced, it is perpetuated over and over and over again. And I'm not saying that it's all bad or all good. For me, what's problematic is it's made as the universal way we meaning, I don't know, all of us are supposed to behave and act, and have always behaved and acted, have always had access. And those are the things I want to push back on, because as it has to do with Black memory, as it has to do with Black experience, it's a little more complicated than that. So last summer, one of the many things that happened in 2020 was that I got asked to do so much more by a lot of predominantly white businesses and organizations to engage. And one of those invitations was something called Denali Camp. Denali Camp is this high-end, low-impact camp in the middle of Denali National Park in Alaska. And they have and when I say high-end, it's important for me to say that people who pay to go were paying $1,100 a night to go. It's cabins that are everything sustainable. There's a greenhouse there. You get your own beautiful cabin. Everybody has an outhouse, but you've never seen an outhouse like this. You see this picture I have up here? That's actually from my outhouse. That's a heart-shaped little window on the door. Beautiful, beautiful, food made fresh for you 3 times a day, really incredible. And they have an author series. So they invite authors to come to spend a week. They pay your way so you can come out and spend a week and be the one in the evening to have conversations. And like a lot of places, if you looked in the past who they invited to have conversations about nature, the environment, I'm just going to say predominantly white, if not all white, and predominantly male identified as well. And so they were trying to change up their game, invite all kinds of people out. I know they had Jeju Lanham out there earlier that summer, myself, other people of color coming out to speak. So I had to fly from Vermont to Anchorage, and it was a long trip to get there, a small prop plane to get into the park. But I changed planes in Newark. And so the reason I'm telling you this story is to say that I had a couple of hours to kill. You're walking around the airport. And I walked into an electronics store because I had to buy something that I lost yet again. And there was a young Black man with dreadlocks working behind the counter. And nobody was in the store. And when he saw me, he just kind of lit up and we started talking, you know, lots of high energy. He was really friendly. And finally he said, so where are you going? And I said, Alaska. And he just kind of did this dramatic, you know, like, what? And he just said, why are you going there? And I understood, one Black person to another, everything that he wasn't saying, what he meant by that was, why are you going there? There are no Black people there. There's like not much there at all. What are you going to do there? Are you going to be safe? But he was like, why are you going there? And I just kind of leaned in and did kind of a fake whisper like this and said, because I'm going to tell them about Black people. And he just went, oh, yes, you need to do that. Good luck with that. And the thing is, I'm also that young Black man. I'm also that young Black man that felt kind of trepidatious about the idea of going to a place like that and everything that it would entail. What doesn't mean he wouldn't do it, but I really understand what he was thinking about and holding, not just for himself, but for me as well. I also, you know, when I came out to California in 2020, the last time I was in California, actually, since COVID, one of the things that I said at the beginning of my talk at Loyola that time, I talked about this idea of attending to place. I told a story about, I think it was 2018, 2019, I got invited to speak at a geography conference in Tasmania. Tasmania is beautiful, by the way. And I was waiting, I was one of the, you know, before it started, there was maybe 200 people, 300 people, a lot of grad students, predominantly white, but you had other non-white students in the audience, a couple of faculty that were asked to speak. Before me, two white professors spoke about place. One was, you know, this was geography, so everybody's intentionally thinking about place in a very particular way. Jeff Malpass, who's a philosopher, got up right before me and he put up all these pictures of these, how can I say it, dead white philosophers and theorists and ideas. And he started speaking about them. And you could, the hum in the audience, everybody was uncomfortable. And one of the reasons they were uncomfortable, because right before the formal part of the conference started, we were all in the lobby and there was an indigenous elder who got up to speak. He was given the floor to speak. His name was Uncle Rodney Dillon. And for 10 minutes, without cracking a smile, he spelled out everything that Australia had done to the indigenous people there. And he did it unapologetically. He just said, you could hear a pin drop in the room. Everybody was quiet because the job was to listen, to hold it, you know, and keep it with us, you know, over the course of the conference. So when this happened and this guy got up and had all these dead white philosophers and he just was going on and on about this, there was this physical discomfort in the room. And I was like, oh my God, am I going to say something when I get up next? What is it he's talking about? Then suddenly he stops, Jeff, and he says, so I want to talk about what it means to attend to place. And he had said all the stuff that's important that we know, that all this is back there in the canon somewhere. And he said there's a picture that had been going around at that time in popular culture on social media. And he wasn't going to put it up there, and I'm glad he didn't. But some of you may remember the picture, the story about the, I think they were Mexican, but I'm not sure. So I want to say Latinx father and his daughter were crossing the border into the United States and didn't make it and were found dead in a riverbed. And he made the point of saying, how are we going to attend to place if we don't attend to who they were as people? And I talked about this, I talked with him later because it really redeemed what it was he was trying to say. He kind of took us on this, he kind of tricked us a little psychological trickeration. He took us down one road and then stopped us cold to say like, and how are we going to do that? How are we going to talk about that father and daughter who died trying to cross the border into this country and everything that they've lost? The picture that I have here up for you that's my mother. So this was probably 10 years ago. My parents grew up in Floyd, Virginia, and I'll talk about them a bit more in a second. And about 10 years ago, we made a family trip down there while we still could. And when we hit Floyd, Virginia, which is where they were from, we first went to where all my mother's people are buried. It was a proper cemetery. We went in, you know, she wanted to see everything. We took pictures, you know, gave thanks, all of that. And then we stopped here. And this land is owned by a white farmer. He was out, he was sitting on his tractor. And I'm like, why are we stopping here? And we got out of the car. My father went up and talked to the farmer, who was very friendly, and said, come on in. And what we discovered was, because that broken down fence you see there in the middle of this photograph, that's where all my father's people are buried. And it's one of those stories where I never got all the information about how that land used to be in his family, how it got lost, and how it is now here, and that my father has to ask permission in order to go in to, have that communion with his family, right? So the question comes back to me again. How do we tell that story as well? And what does it mean? The white farmer was very friendly, but that's not actually the point. The point is what got lost, the land that gets lost, the Black history that gets lost, the memories that gets lost, and how people like my parents still have to ask for permission to show up there for their family. I always have to tell the story of myself. The reason I do that, people know I do it for multiple reasons, and I'm not going to talk about, because issues of who we stand with and how we stand. It's one of the things I say. But in relationship to today's conversation and asking who does the archiving, who does the remembering, why do we do it, and why is it important? I wrote here, it's personal. I know this is an academic space, but I say this in any space, whether I'm talking in an academic space, a business space, outdoor retailing, a nonprofit space, a church space, it doesn't matter. It is always personal, right? And I'm not going to pretend that it's not personal. Actually, I want my bias to be fully on the table, because much like Toni Morrison, I am the readers of what it is that I read. Much like that young man in the store that's trying to find a place for himself and a way for himself in the world, right? I need to put myself in the story because it informs how I tell the story. Most of you probably know the incredible African-American lawyer, Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson has been to the Supreme Court 5 times. The movie True Justice, that's about him, with Michael B. Jordan. He started that incredible site down in Alabama, that lynching site there that you can go see, and actually invites people in towns where lynchings have taken place to come and own that in a very particular way. I watched this documentary about him, and we're the same age, we're born one day apart. He doesn't have a partner, he doesn't have kids, me too, me too, me too. He works all the time. And the interviewer asked him, why do you do what you do? And the first thing he said is, I do what I do because the system is broken. And I'm nodding vigorously, from my couch, and I'm writing it down. Yeah, me too. And then he pauses and he says, well, I do what I do because people are broken. And I'm like, yeah, that makes me too. And then his voice got kind of soft and he said, I do what I do because I'm broken too. And that laid me out. There was something about, he wasn't afraid to say what is true and what's always been true for myself as well, that there's personal healing for those of us who identify as Black, who show up to talk about Blackness in a very particular way. And in this case, on the land, but for me, it actually doesn't matter where we're talking about it, that we're talking about it, that of course, we're also talking about ourselves. And in the question of rigor, right, for me, it is not simply intellectual rigor, but it's emotional rigor, it's spiritual rigor, it's figuring out what does my body need to show up and be in this moment in a way with everyone to have this conversation. So, got to talk about my parents quickly, but I got to talk about them a little bit. This is Henry and Rose. They grew up in Floyd, Virginia. They grew up poor, large Black families, high school education, not an unusual story. My dad went off to fight in the Korean War. And when he came back from the Korean War, he had to get a job. And he said he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform. He thought that looked like a great government job, and as a veteran, he thought perfect fit. But when he went to apply for that job in the state of Virginia, they told him, I'm sorry, but we don't hire Negroes. So my parents went north, like a lot of folks, and they went to New York. And in New York, my dad had 2 job offers. One was 5 hours north of New York City in Syracuse, where he could be a janitor, and he didn't take that job. But the job he took was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. A very wealthy Jewish family owned a 12-acre estate in the images that you will see here. And they needed full-time caretakers for that estate. They needed a gardener, they needed a chauffeur, they needed a sometime housekeeper. My parents took that job. There are 2 houses There's a little freezing there. Here we go. There are two houses on this property. One was the gardener's cottage, what you're looking at right here. And in a minute, I'll show you what I like to call the big house. The owners would come up there on weekends and holidays. This was and still is a very wealthy, and at the time I grew up there, all white neighborhood. And I mean incredibly wealthy. Harry Winston had property down the street. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived next door. Wingfoot Golf Club was around the corner. We were the only family of color that lived in this neighborhood until the 1990s, when a Japanese American woman moved in for a while and then she moved out. The story that I tell people, first of all, well, let me back up a little bit and say, so my parents wanted to have kids and they thought they couldn't have kids. And so with the help of the owners, they adopted me. And then what I always say is they relaxed and had my first brother. They did some more relaxing and had my second brother. So me and my brothers, during the course of the week, we had run of this place because the owners usually weren't there. There's a swimming pool, there's a small pond, which meant we all knew how to swim by the time we were 7. We were riding our bike, we were playing in the woods, we were outside. My sense of that non-human nature outside myself was formed entirely by my experience on these 12 acres that we didn't own, but my parents cared for all the time. When I was 9 years old, the other story that I like to tell is, because you had so much wealth in the neighborhood, always policemen patrolling the area. I went to a public school, Mamaroneck Avenue Public School, largely Italian-American working class, some African-American working class. And I was walking home, so 4th grade, right? I was right around the corner from the house, and a white policeman in his car stopped me and he wanted to know where I was going. And I gave him the address and I pointed because I was very close. And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm thinking, I'm 9, like what's happening right now? But what I said was no, and I was kind of confused. I said, I live there. And so then he let me go. I go home, I tell my parents, my father calls the police station, he gave them hell. And the policeman didn't bother me or my brothers again. But as an adult, I think about the logics. What were the logics there? I was a little girl coming home from school, time of day. What was it about me that he imagined? This was the late 60s, early 70s, that I was going there to work at 9. Like there's so many aspects of it that really bothered me. And none of this sounds unusual to most of us today because we hear these stories all the time. Who gets to be there, who doesn't, who looks right in on this land, in this beautiful nature. I want to jump ahead into the 1990s. The patriarch who owned the land had died many years earlier. The matriarch was now very sick. My parents have now been caring for this land for over 40 years. And to her credit, she wanted to try to keep my parents on this land. Power is complicated. When she died, she requested that my father was at her bedside. I think love and power coexists all the time. In the end, my parents couldn't stay on this land. It was worth over $3 million at the time, property taxes over $125,000 a year. So it wasn't going to work out. The owner had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, because my youngest brother at this point was married and had kids and was living there. And so that's where they had a house built for them. This gate is now on this driveway. It wasn't there when I lived there. She passed away. A new owner came on. He asked my parents to stay on for a while. They stayed on for like another 5-6 years. So now they're in their 70s. Now they've been caring for this land for nearly 50 years. At this point, I'm back in school. I'm working on my doctorate, and I was very focused on sort of gender and conservation and environmental issues. But this is at the pivot point where things kind of shifted for me because it got really personal in a way that up to that point, gender hadn't been quite as personal for me. I'm not saying gender isn't personal, but for me at that moment. 2003, they left the land. They have a lovely house on a half-acre of land in Leesburg. And maybe 5 years or a few years after that, maybe 3 years, I can't remember exactly when, but I know it was in the middle of me doing this research. They got a copy of a letter, and the letter was from the Westchester Land Trust. And the Westchester Land Trust was letting everybody in the old neighborhood know that a conservation easement had now been placed on this piece of land, which I understood to mean that in perpetuity, everything here would be protected. It had images of the land. It talked about the wildlife and the trees that grow and where the land sits at the watershed, and the importance of protecting it. And I didn't disagree with any of it, actually, to be honest with you. It was just that when I got to the end of the letter, the land trust thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness, who'd been on the land for maybe 5 years. And there was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who'd cared for that land for nearly 50 years. And just like that, they were gone. And that is the point for me that it became really personal, to understand that not only was my home was gone, but the experience, the work, the sweat, the blood, the time, and the love that my parents put into that land was gone just like that, with no thought. Not because the people who did it are bad people, but privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself. So they just weren't aware of it, right? They just weren't aware of it, though it was right in front of them all the time. And I started thinking about all the people in the history of this country, particularly Black and Brown, Indigenous, who have always been on the land, have always been there, caring, engaging, creating place, attending to place in very particular ways, and what happens when they get erased. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but Jade mentioned, Dr. Sasser mentioned that I'm working on my second book. And I have to say to you, it's actually the book I've always wanted to write. It was the reason before I went back to school and I was backpacking for the better part of 5 years, and after my acting career and all the things that I was thinking about, what is the story that I really wanted to tell? I just didn't have the confidence to, at that time, to even know how it is you're going to write a book and how you're going to do that. So I want to talk about race, land, and belonging, and I want to tell it from a much more personal place, right? Because I see it, I wrote here, I hope that it is an invitation for others to claim where it is that they stand and be willing to look into those places that some of us try to ignore and erase. And I have to tell you, it is the hardest thing that I have ever tried to write. I am having such a hard time because of the degree of vulnerability. How much do you tell? How much do you say? I believe in the moniker that not everybody deserves your truth. I also believe that there's such a thing as radical vulnerability, but what does it mean for me to say it as a Black woman? All the things. How much of myself, my family's truth am I going to put on the table? How am I going to do that in relationship to larger issues, both of the past and the present that exist, that all of us are always operating in at all times? What will it mean? I wrote here, what is my intention in telling this story in relationship to a world that hasn't always honored my family and people who look like me? And I put this slide up here about Alice Walker, because Alice Walker for me was, when my Aunt Bert first gave me Color Purple when it came out, I think it's like 1980, it's been a while ago. I had been an avid reader. I'd read anything and everything all the time, but I had never seen a book where a 13-year-old Black girl was the star of the book, star of the story, telling it from her point of view in that way. And it blew my mind. Actually, I was confused. I remember like reading it and then I have to start over again because I was like, what's happening right now? Like, I don't even know how to get my mind to switch to this place where she's the star of the story. She's at the center of the story. When Color Purple, Steven Spielberg got the rights and decided to make that movie on Color Purple. A couple of years after the movie version came out, about 10 years later, Alice Walker wrote a book, a nonfiction book called The Same River Twice. And she talked about what it was like to see this story come to the screen, and what impact it had on her. And she starts the book this way. She said, I belong to a people so wounded by betrayal, so hurt by misplacing their trust, that to offer us a gift of love is often to risk one's life, certainly name and reputation. I do not mean only the Africans sold and bought and sold again, or the Indians who joyfully fed those who, when strong, gleefully starved them out. I speak as well of the shadowy European ancestor, resentfully denied, except that one cannot forget the thatched one-room hovels of old Europe put to the torch by those who grabbed the land. And the grief of the starving ashen ancestor, forced to seek his or her lonely fortune in a land that seemed to demand ruthlessness if one intended to survive. I belong to a people, heart and mind, who do not trust mirrors, not those, in any case, in which ourselves appear. if you remember or know the story of Color Purple, you know, one of the through lines is the story of Mr., the Black man who's the patriarch of the family who abuses the women in the family. It's the easiest way for me to say it. The part was played by Danny Glover in the movie. When the movie came out, Alice Walker talked about all the hate mail she got, most of it from Black people. And it laid her out for 3 years, the depression that she went into. She thinks about, these are the people I love the most. These are my people. And these were the people that were sending her hate mail. They were angry. They were angry. Why was she painting the story of Mr., this Black man who abuses Black women? Why are you telling that story? It's like putting our dirty laundry out there for others to see. Why are you doing this? In 2005 and 6, when I was writing up my dissertation, I was living in Atlanta, and the wonderful Black writer Valerie Boyd, who died about a year ago, who wrote the only Black biography of Zora Neale Hurston, Wrapped in Rainbows. I had befriended her, and she was friends with Alice Walker, and we got an invitation to come to New York City to see the opening night of Color Purple on Broadway. And of course I said, yes, dissertation, I'm going to see Alice Walker on Broadway. And at the end, Oprah got up on stage and, you know, did it in the way that Oprah does it, talked about her experience working on Color Purple, the film, and thanking the cast. And then she invited Alice Walker up on stage. And Alice Walker, not saying one word about herself, just said she needed everybody to understand that this story was a story about redemption. Because yes, Mr. was abusive, and yes, he got pushed out for a little while, but then he got called back in. And that's actually the power in it, like our ability to actually see our whole selves in a way that doesn't cancel ourselves out, but actually brings ourselves back in. And what better person to tell that story about one Black person than another Black person who's coming to it with love and understands that and is not afraid to say what's true, you know, who's not afraid to say what's true, which doesn't mean you don't love your people. It doesn't mean you don't love the memory of who we are. It doesn't mean that you are actually trying to see yourself outside of that, but you actually are thinking about wholeness, the question of wholeness and who we are and how do we show up for that wholeness. So I want to go back really briefly to this, what's happening now on that land, because a lot has happened since 2020. In 2019, right before COVID, every year at Telluride, there's a mountain film festival, environmental films. And that year, their theme had been equity. And they invited a bunch of people to come speak. They had Robin DiAngelo, White Privilege. They asked me to come, a bunch of other folks to come and speak. And the audience was predominantly white, very well-heeled, lots of filmmakers, about 900 people sitting in the room. You're on this big stage, and I just had 20, 25 minutes. So I said, whose story counts? And I told this story and said a few other things around it. In 2020, I got an email from a white filmmaker who had been in the audience. Her name is Irene Taylor, and she's won Emmys for her work. I realized I knew who it was when she told me who she was, and I'd seen some of her work. And she said, would you get on Zoom and speak with me? I said, sure. And we got on Zoom. She said, so HBO has commissioned me to do a documentary about trees. And I'd already sort of lined up all the stories I want to tell, because the way that I want to tell them is I want to talk about real people in association with a particular species of tree. So she's going to talk about the Weyerhaeuser family, for instance, who made a lot of money off timber, and one of them got kidnapped, and there's a whole story in there. She said, but she realized she had not a single story about anybody African-American. And she had thought about what I had said, and could I help her think about, excuse me, what that might be? And I said, sure, but I was feeling a little bit like a trickster. So I kind of smiled a little bit. And I said, well, if you're going to tell a story in the United States about Black people and trees, you might want to think about lynching. And she kind of, went like this a little bit and said, you're right, but I'm not the person to do it. And then I kind of softened. I said, yes, and we're not just the bad things that happen to us. And I talked about my parents. So this is the very last day my parents were on the land. That tree behind them is a weeping cherry tree, Prunus pendula. My father had given my mother that tree many, many years earlier for a wedding gift. A wedding anniversary gift, excuse me. And obviously they couldn't take the tree with them when they moved. And so I just said that, because I was trying to get her to think, of other ways. Well, the short of it is she loved the story so much. She says, I'd love to tell that story if you would give me permission. Well, at the same time, I had been in conversation with the New York Botanical Gardens in New York, who was also saying, what are you working on? We'd love to support that. I'm telling you, 2020 was something. And I also told them about this story. And they said, we're the New York Botanical Gardens. And I'm like, I know. I bet you if we could get on that property, we could get a grafting of that tree, bring it back to the New York Botanical Gardens and tell a story about your parents. And I was blown away. I was like, oh my God, that would be incredible. So the film crew wanted to film it. New York Botanical Gardens wanted to get on that property. They developed a relationship with the Westchester Land Trust. There are brand new owners who live on the property now. There's a white couple who are doctors who don't know anything about my family at all, right? So it was all this relationship building that had to happen over Zoom, right? Because this was during COVID. The folks at the Land Trust said, Carolyn, can you send us a picture so we know exactly where the tree is? So I sent them this photograph. You can see the tree there. There's the pink hydrangea bush. And this was very close to our house. And I was initially kind of surprised that they hadn't seen it, because I thought everything was protected because there was a conservation easement. And of course, I learned that everything was not protected. There were only select trees on this property that were being protected. And this wasn't one of them. I sent them that picture. And maybe a few weeks later, this is the picture they sent back. The entire thing had been landscaped. The tree had been cut down. Now, when this got sent to me, the director was devastated, New York Botanical Gardens, the folks, but this laid me out. I was angry, I was upset. It didn't matter to me who did it and why they did it, but it told me something about how privilege operates and, again, how erasure happens. And for about 3 days, the filmmaker and I were like, well, I guess the story's dead in the water. And then on the 4th day, I woke up and said, no, this is actually the story. The story is about erasure and how it happens and what it means and the impact it has, not just on my family, but actually on everyone and the way we talk about environmental history and history in general. And then about another day or two passed, and I think I was feeling a bit kinder in the heart. And I said, well, what if we could get everybody to agree to plant a new weeping cherry tree? And it took some doing, right? But the Land Trust finally agreed to do it. They said they'd even supply the tree. The New York Botanical Gardens was down. The only people we couldn't get a yes from right away were the owners. And I decided to write them personally, the woman in particular. And I wrote a letter to her saying who I was. I never used the word race once. I said I was Black and my family was Black, and I talked about them, but I didn't talk about race. But I talked about how I wanted to honor my family and the kind of work that I was doing. That woman wrote me back in 20 minutes and said, I would like to honor your family. And so in July of 2021, we got all on the property. And I just want to say to the audience here, it looks like I'm doing all the work. I really wasn't. There was a forester. He did the hard job of digging that. I just came up symbolically, threw in some dirt here and there and helped out a little bit, but he really did all the work. The president of the Westchester Land Trust came. One of the owners was there. There was the crew. I had a young Black filmmaker named Sawyer that came with me, as well as the film crew for HBO and the Black dramaturge and playwright, the wonderful Dr. Omi Jones, as well, on that land. And what I want to say about that was that for me, the point here was that now everybody becomes accountable to the tree. And I realized I wanted to be able to set this down, to know that it isn't, I know there's the question of extraction and transaction and the way many of our stories have been taken from us with allowing us no claim to those stories. For some of us, we've even lost our names because of that. And I understand that. And I also understand that these stories of Blackness on the landscape are stories about being American on the landscape. They're stories about being human on the landscape, and we will not be left out of that story. And everybody should be accountable and responsible to that story. I don't care how bad it makes anybody feel, how difficult it is to address it. I'll stand with you as you're trying to work it out, okay? But so many of us have been feeling that way for hundreds of years. So for me, it's about also finding that way in, as well as my own accountability to actually show up with that story in a very particular way and tell it. In April of 2022, the Land Trust promised me that once a year, soon I should be getting the new photo, because every April they'll send me one. And they wanted me to know how the tree was doing, and you can see that it's doing really well. But what really moved me here is that the owners took it upon themselves to plant daffodils both around the tree and the spot behind it, which is where the old tree had been. There's just a stump. And what blew me away about that was that they had no way of knowing that daffodils were my father's favorite flower. And so there's something for me to be said about the place of redemption. And everybody who knows me knows, I'm not saying that we can just get to kumbaya without doing the work, right? Doing the work. And this is the work all the time, right? Of thinking about how we tell our stories, how we uplift our stories. What is the personal healing in it for me and my family, and how am I accountable to that because of my own privilege and the place that I stand? The last thing that I want to say is I want to talk about the Black artist, Robert S. Duncanson. Robert S. Duncanson, you can see he was 1821. So he was back alive during slavery here in the United States. And I discovered him when I was watching the inaugural, when Joe Biden got inaugurated as president. And Senator Roy Blount presented him with this painting, and it was called Landscape with a Rainbow, which you'll see here, right? Landscape with a Rainbow, 1859. And when he said, as soon as I heard African-American, the thing that blew me away, because this looked like a lot of bucolic landscape paintings from that time, but it has a rainbow and it was painted by a Black man while slavery was in place, right? So a Black man whose body could be someone's property. I read he suffered from mental illness. I heard that he had to go over the border to Canada, but he still painted a rainbow, which symbolizes potential and possibility, right? He still did that. I want to go back to the tombstone because he's from Detroit and was buried in Detroit. And I was out there this fall and a group of people, I mentioned this in a talk, and a Black artist said, that they just got a tombstone for his site because for a long time, there was no tombstone even showing where he was buried. Right? Even though one of his paintings hangs in the White House, a bunch of them are sitting in a museum there in Detroit. I mean, he's fairly prolific in his painting. And then I thought of Zora Neale Hurston, who also for a long time had no tombstone indicating where she was. That erasure is something that happens all the time. And it was a group of people getting together and said, no, we can't have that. We've got to make sure that we all know who he is and what he contributed to our story, and why that's important. For me, this is another Nikki Finney quote that I always like to point to. I'm accountable to truth and beauty. Because for me, in telling these stories of who we are in the land and how we make the land is to never, ever forget the love and the joy that's also part of that experience. Black people as a whole have lost a lot, but we've also gained a lot. Black people as a whole have suffered a lot, but they've also loved a lot. And they're some of the quickest people to laugh at and enjoy and find the joy in there. And I think there's a way to hold that. I refuse to be seen as simply part of an oppressed people, as though we are not more than that, as though we cannot be more than that, and as though we have never been. We've always been more than that. We've always been more than that. And so how am I accountable to the way that I hold that story and that complexity and show up unafraid to say the things that I feel that need to be said, but also thinking forward in that way? So if you don't know, and yeah, this is a plug, and I'm going to say the plug. I want to get the book here. 2 weeks ago, this book just came out. So Aaron Sharkey is this wonderful Black writer and creative out of Minnesota. It's called A Darker Wilderness, Black Nature Writing from Soil to Stars. And a number of us, including myself, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Laurette Savoy, and others were asked to write essays. The difference in the way we were asked to write these essays was that she sent us each old pictures of Black people on the landscape in the United States. People we didn't know, but from like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, sitting outside, farming, doing whatever they were doing as a point of inspiration. What does it mean to actually think about the memories of who they are, the memories of who we are on the land as we work to kind of create that broader sense of, I don't know, what do you want to call it, Black ecology of who we are, that story. And in my essay, the very last thing that I wrote, which is how I'm going to end here, is I said, here's what I know. We are undeniable because we are part of a larger story of place and time. Because the before and after always has us in between. Because we are dust to dust. Because to know a thing is to love a thing, and we love deeply. And because all of our stories are in relationship, I am because you are, upright and resolute. And the land remembers even if we do not, for as the earth breathes, so do we, because this is our home. Thank you.